No dream is too big, no challenge is too great. Nothing we want for our future is beyond our reach. America will no longer settle for anything less than the best. We will get along with all other nations, willing to get along with us. We will be.
Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar. In a result that stunned America and shaken the world, Donald Trump has been elected the 45th President of the United States. And now the big question is, what does a Trump presidency mean for America, for India, for the fight against terror, and of course, for major countries like China and Russia? The one thing that stood out since the results is Trump's acceptance speech. He spoke about unifying America and healing divisions, and he was particularly gracious about Hillary Clinton, stating that America owes her an enormous debt for her service. With me to talk about Donald Trump's victory and what it means is India's former ambassador to America, Arun Kumar Singh, the New York Times Chief of Bureau, Ellen Berry, a fellow of the Brookings Institution, Dhruv Jaishankar, and the Financial Times Chief of Bureau, Amy Kasman. Joining us from Washington, the former editor of the Times of India, Gautam Adhikari, and a fellow of the American Enterprise Institute, Sadanand Dhume. Amy Kasman, are you stunned by the result? And I mean not just Donald Trump's victory, but the sheer size and scale of it.
Well, it's funny because yesterday I was being asked to call the election by several Indian TV channels, and I kept saying I refuse to call this election. Looked what happened during Brexit. All the polls were showing that Britain would stay in the EU. There was a complete surprise. So I kind of, on a rational level, had calculated in the potential for the polls to be wrong and for a surprise thing. But I think emotionally it would be true to say that I'm still trying to really digest that and get my head around the implications of it.
So you are truly shaken by the outcome?
I'm disappointed.
Ellen Berry, yours was one of the many papers that endorsed Hillary Clinton. How shaken are you by the fact that your countrymen have opted to make president a man like Donald Trump and his views and his attitude to women, his tax-paying record or failure to pay tax, as well as the fact that he has really no experience in government? How shaken are you by the decision your countrymen have come to?
Well, look, I think today we were reminded of something that has always been true of America, at least for the last 5 election cycles, which is that it's basically a country that is split 50-50 right down the middle between the Democratic and Republican Party. I think in this case, a lot more of the less educated, more rural white people came out than anyone expected. And the Republicans kind of came home and voted on party lines in a way that wasn't expected. So I think in some ways this is sort of reminding us of truths about our country.
And when you say a truth about your country, do you mean the fact that it's divided and not united, or do you mean that actually demons that were hidden have suddenly surfaced?
I think it is a reminder that there is a huge split between the people who live in cities and the people who are not white, and the people who live in exurban or rural areas and are white. You just see most people live in communities where there's an overwhelming sentiment in one direction or the other. So yeah, we absolutely have a bifurcated country.
I want very much Sadanand Dhume to actually focus on Trump and what he means and how we should relate to him. But let me ask a quick question about Hillary Clinton. What do you make of her behavior last night? She was very public in criticizing Trump when he said he wouldn't necessarily accept the result when he was asked that question at the debate. But last night she was very reluctant to concede, and she only did so after her manager had actually said she wasn't going to speak at all. And even then, she hasn't as yet spoken to the American people. So what do you make of her behavior?
Is that a question for me, Karan?
It is indeed, yes.
I mean, I think that it would have been much better if she'd come out and spoken with her supporters. That would have been the classy thing to do. That would have been the gracious thing to do. But on the other hand, we should not conflate this with not accepting the will of the people. It's not as though she's disputing this result. It's not as though she's going to court. She's obviously stunned and shocked, and she did not believe it would come to this. But she has accepted the will of the people, which is very different from our worries about Trump at the time, which was that he said he may not accept the result of the election. So I think those two things are quite different, in fact.
One other quick question to you, Gautam Adhikari, about Hillary Clinton. Has her failure last night to come out surprised and shaken the American people? Because the one thing I noticed everyone commented upon was that this was really bad sportsmanship, something you expect in a democracy from the losing candidate.
Well, frankly, I haven't heard much of that. And she called Donald Trump and conceded and congratulated him. And that's what was expected, a concession. As Sadanand said, she didn't challenge the result like Trump had threatened to at one stage, or not accept it, or not to concede the results if he didn't like them. She accepted it, and after John Podesta came out and said that she's not likely to speak to her supporters, she called Trump and spoke to him personally. I think that was taken in the right spirit by most people. Maybe perhaps some TV commentators somewhere may have said something, but I don't think that's an issue.
All right, let's come back to Trump, because that's what I want to focus on. Arun Singh, his election hasn't just shaken people in America, it's probably shaken the world. And it's probably not untrue to say that most chancelleries were hoping and expecting he would lose. How do you think this is perceived, and what does it show about America to the Brits and the Germans and the French, and obviously to us?
Well, our approach has been that it's for the American people to decide who they want to elect. And we would be happy to work with whoever has been elected. And you'd have seen that now for more than 20 years, there is a broad bipartisan support in the United States for the India relationship.
I'll come to the India relationship in a moment's time, but most people have a perception of America, and Trump doesn't fit into it. And then when you find the Americans choosing Trump and choosing him with such a sizable victory, does it shake and surprise people, and do they start rethinking about how they view America?
So I would say that it should not really surprise people, because of course you have a certain perception, but when you look at issues in depth, you look at the debates that have taken place in the United States, not just in the past year and a half as the campaign played out, but even earlier, there is a clear recognition that there are deep divisions in the United States. There are divisions based on race, there are divisions based on ethnicity, there's the rural-urban divide, there's division based on the level of education. So like any other society, the US has deep divisions, which is also reflected in this election cycle. And as one of the commentators just pointed out, even in the earlier election cycles, the vote has been almost evenly split several times over.
But has Trump made these divisions, these inequalities, these differences more apparent than they were? Because up till now, the world hasn't seen America in terms of these divisions. Now, they become the first thing you notice, the first thing you think about.
I mean, I think we had a prelude to some of this before. We had the Tea Party, we had other things. I think one thing, though, to stress is that Trump is not a standard Republican. I mean, this is, everything we've seen has, defied expectations in multiple ways, but he hasn't run on a typical Republican platform. You had senior Republicans who refused to endorse him. The last Republican president of the United States refused to vote for him in this election. So, this idea that it's just a traditional Republican-Democrat divide that has just, seen a slight changing of the votes, a few more people coming out. I'm not sure that that's the best way to look at this election. This has really been unprecedented in many, many ways.
So the Republican Party itself, at least in certain quarters, will be very shaken by the outcome.
And very divided. They'll have control of the House and Senate and the presidency, which in other circumstances would give an immense amount of authority to the party, in power. But this will be a Republican Party that will have significant debates internally about America's position in the world, about economic policy, about immigration, about a whole host of issues. So I'm not sure it'll be as easy as it may seem.
I'm reminded, Amy, of something, because you were on the show with me yesterday, as was Gautam Adhikari, and I'm reminded of something that both of you said. You said that the election, as we came to the end of the campaign and the voting began yesterday, was a battle for the soul of America. I think you said it was a struggle to identify the idea of America. Today, with this outcome, Has that battle been won or lost?
No, I would think that actually the battles are just beginning. I think that Donald Trump in his campaign embodied a kind of backward-looking vision of America, a vision. I mean, he tapped into a sentiment among a certain sector of voters, which has turned out to be at least a majority of those who cast ballots. Whether it's a majority of all Americans is unknown, but he tapped into a longing for, I think, a kind of a backward-looking America, an America where perhaps white men ruled the roost, a more homogeneous society, a society where people knew their place, and I think
and that is not the America you identify with, clearly.
I mean, I'm a Californian. It's a solid Hillary state, basically. I'm a big city girl. I have, I'm a college, I fit the demographic of a Hillary voter. So, but yeah, I mean, for me, America is a multi-ethnic society, a society of tolerance for individuals making their own free choices. But I think that one thing is, ironically, although Donald Trump really articulated this kind of very dark vision, I think there are questions about to what extent he himself actually believes in that vision, because until he became a political candidate, he himself was moving in more urban circles. He was liberal, he was pally with Hillary Clinton. So I'm not sure that he's actually a true conservative at heart, but what's kind of alarming is the extent to which he might be willing to adopt any position that he thinks will plummet him to power.
Let me bring you in on that one, because Gautam, yesterday as well on this show, you echoed this thought that the campaign was in a sense a struggle for the soul of America. You've just heard Amy say that she's not absolutely sure that the darker side of America, I think that was the phrase that he so effectively tapped into, is something that he actually believes in himself. In other words, she was suggesting that he might have been political and opportunistic in pitching his campaign along those lines. Do you believe that's what he did? That he's not a true representative of that viewpoint, but someone who simply effectively and therefore successfully exploited it?
Whatever that may be, he is clearly the leader of the Republican Party, which now has control of the executive branch, the legislative branch, both the houses, Senate and the House of Congress. And they are likely to appoint a Supreme Court judge now who would restore the full bench, which is 9 judges. It's 8 at the moment. It's unlikely that they would recommend the person who President Obama has put forward to the Senate and is pending approval. So this is the kind of authority and power that the Republican Party has, which they haven't had in quite a while. So, but Donald Trump is clearly the leader. I also wanted to clarify something. You mentioned the scale of victory, and you thought it was impressive, but it's really rather narrow. In fact, in the popular vote, Hillary Clinton has got a fraction more than Donald Trump. She's got 47.6% of the vote, and Donald Trump has got 47.5%. But because of the quirks of the American electoral system, where
that was what I had in mind, that he could end up with 300 electoral college votes.
No, he has not got 300. So, I mean, the point is that he has far less than that, and Hillary Clinton has 218, I think. So it's despite getting a fraction less than Hillary Clinton in terms of the popular vote, but that's how the American system operates.
Sadanan Dume, what do you make of the mood that was so obviously anti-Washington, D.C.? Clearly, one of the thoughts that he tapped into successfully was when he kept talking about what he called the corrupt political class, when he talked about his desire to drain the swamp. Does that worry you that there's such a deep alienation between the American people almost as a whole and those they perceive as the elite who rule them?
It concerns me. I think this is part of a larger global phenomenon. You could argue that some people saw a similar backlash against narrow ruling elites reflected in the Brexit vote. You might even argue that it was reflected in the 2014 vote in India. I think what we've had is this, we've had globalization produce a class of people, including many of the people on this panel, who in many ways cross national boundaries, cross the usual boundaries of ethnicity and faith and nation. And what we're seeing in many parts of the world is a backlash against this. Now, whether this is something dark or whether this is something that in the long term can be contained by democracy and it turns out to be relatively benign, is something that frankly we cannot answer this morning. All we can say today is that this is a political earthquake in the world's largest and most powerful democracy, and we have to see whether the darker interpretation of this or the more benign interpretation of this is what plays out in the coming months and years.
Ellen Barry, do you have any sense of how the Latinos, who are around 18-19% of the American population, are responding to this? I mean, one of the threats that hangs over them is the commitment, I don't know whether he'll stand to it, but the commitment that Trump made to some alleged 11 million will be deported.
Right. You know, I mean, I think one of the things that made him so unusual in this cycle is that Republican candidates have been extremely careful not to alienate the Latino or Hispanic vote. There was almost a notion that if the Republicans could not kind of secure that constituency, the party itself would not survive. But Trump made the calculation that he could throw all that stuff out the window and say often offensive, sometimes derisive or derogatory, outrageous things, encouraging gun owners to rise up or saying that he would lock up his opponent. He basically took the chance that by including that kind of language in a campaign that he could actually win, and I think it really benefited him.
You were Ambassador Arun Singh till just about the end of August, and that's very nearby. How do American Muslims view what's happened? After at one point in his campaign, he actually said he would bar Muslims from entering the country, although he seems to have stepped down or stepped away from that. But would they be fearful today?
So I'm sure there have been concerns not just among segments of the American Muslim opinion, but also, for example, Hispanic, in the African American community. So several of these comments and indications of policy did arouse concern in those communities. But it is also clear that the majority of the people, a majority as reflected in the Electoral College vote, have gone in favor of Mr. Trump, largely because in the middle class white American segment, wages have stagnated over the past several years. Some studies have pointed out that death rates have gone up, longevity has come down. So there is a feeling in that community that with the globalization and the change happening in the United States, they have not benefited from that process.
And do they additionally therefore look upon Muslims as intruders and interlopers that they want to keep out? Do they share the sentiment that Trump expressed about Muslims? Because if they do, that would heighten the anxiety and apprehension that Muslims in America would feel today.
So I would say at one level there's a concern related to terrorism, and therefore that also reflects and gets related very often to Muslim segments of the population, not just in the United States but elsewhere. But going beyond terrorism, there's also concern related to immigration in general, and because there is a large number of illegal immigrant population in the United States, and when unemployment was high, that also led to concerns related to illegal immigration.
The Democrats were either blind or oblivious to these concerns to do with immigration, to do with the identification of Muslims as a sort of source of terror. Is that because they simply were refusing to see it, or is it because there was a certain, how shall I put it, political correctness that stopped them expressing it, as a result of which the distance between them and the American electorate actually grew, and it ended up cementing in some way Trump to the American people?
I don't think they were completely ignorant of it, but that this did strike a chord with some section of the electorate. But some of it may have been political correctness. Some of it is also that the Democrats have become identified as a party of immigrants. I mean, Indian Americans, despite being socially conservative and amongst the wealthiest groups, traditionally, I mean, this should be a prime Republican vote base. It still continues to vote consistently for the Democrats. So, so Democrats have become identified as a party of immigrant groups and minorities. So I think that was one of that clearly is one of the reasons, but I think it was perhaps much more complex than some of these, some of the models and some of the expectations really made it out to be.
Edinburgh, isn't it odd or even paradoxical that a billionaire who was born in luxury and comfort a man who's gone through 2 bankruptcies, if I've got it right, should end up reflecting the beliefs and feelings and sentiments of white, less well-educated, working-class people. I mean, in every way, he is the opposite to them, and yet through him, they saw their own thoughts and views being reflected. Isn't that a paradox? Or is that just an example of a good politician?
Well, I think, you know, he's a guy who has a long career performing in front of an audience, and he understood that the things he was saying was awakening something in the crowds he was facing. So I suppose, to me, it's not surprising that he's a guy who is not so much a businessman as a, you know, as a performer. He's a showman.
And what a show he put on. Sadhana Dume, one of the things that would worry the world is the commitment he seemed to make in his speeches to repealing or at least rewriting or at least renegotiating a variety of trade deals, not just NAFTA but also TPP. Do you see that happening? And do you see that being very disruptive for the world?
It certainly seems to be one of his core convictions, and one of the things that really set him apart from mainstream Republicans who have often, who have held free trade as an article of faith. Now, it remains to be seen whether he will have the wiggle room to push this through. Let's see the kind of advisors who are around him. But at this moment, I think this is certainly something that the world should worry about. It has tremendous implications for the global economy. It has tremendous implications also for wider US strategy in Asia and security that is related to it. So at this point, I think it would be very foolish to not take him at his word. He has been speaking in these crude mercantilist terms about trade since the 1980s. So this certainly seems to be something he believes in. Let's see how it plays out in policy.
If he were to try and renegotiate trade deals, Gautam Adhikari, or to even repeal them, would he have the support of the 2 houses of the American Congress? I know that they both now have Republican majorities, and they earlier had as well. But would those very people support him in repealing or renegotiating, or would that be an obstacle he'd have to confront?
I think Donald Trump is both a performer and a fairly sharp businessman, a deal maker, and therefore I think every position that is taken is eventually negotiable. So whether he would actually scrap trade deals, I'm not very sure. What he might do is adjust a few and carry while his sort of impressive performance is still fresh in people's minds. He would like to carry most Republicans with him. And the point is that both the Senate and the House are in Republican hands. And at this point of time, in the first few months of Donald Trump's presidency, I don't think that either the senators or Republican congressmen would like to oppose him as such. So they would negotiate, and I think he would be able to get through some of the ideas that he has promised earlier.
One of the things that was repeatedly said by his opponents and certainly by his critics was, would you want a man like Donald Trump to have his finger on the nuclear button? Mm-hmm. Well, now he will have his finger on the nuclear button come the 20th of January. Does that worry you? Will there be increased nuclear insecurity, or is that simply an exaggerated fear?
So it doesn't worry me, because clearly once he becomes the president, he will be receiving detailed briefings. He'll be absorbing those briefings. He'll have a whole institutional structure around him. Of course, the US president takes the final call, but there'll be a whole institutional structure around him to brief him, prepare him for the issues and the decisions to be made. And I'm sure we will see change happening in his stance, policy choices after his inauguration in January.
Do you believe that the American system will constrain, restrain, advise, and perhaps hold his hand back from some of the impulsiveness he's repeatedly shown during the campaign?
I think it is going to be a test of the system and to what extent it can moderate him. And I mean, he has shown himself to be very impulsive and kind of says shooting from the hip kind of style. As has been said, he's an entertainer. He kind of possibly goes for the shock value in some of the things. I think It'll be a test of the system. I hope he'll have strong advisors around him. It is yet to see who they may be, but that will kind of keep his worst instincts under control. But it will be a challenge.
At the end of the day, he is Commander-in-Chief.
Yes.
Can a Commander-in-Chief be repeatedly restrained by lesser generals, captains and majors?
Yes, I think he actually can. I mean, the Commander-in-Chief, again, as Ambassador Singh said, has the ultimate authority, but is basically at the pinnacle of a much larger system. And I think it will be quite curious to see in the coming weeks who he appoints around him. I mean, this is a very unusual Republican or any party campaign, in that usually by this time Washington insiders have a sense of who the people will be around him, who will be advising him, who will have the various key portfolios. But it is also interesting to see some of the people who are being rumored to be in contention for various senior cabinet positions. These are not the people who you would think about putting in place if you're trying to drain the swamp. It's people like Newt Gingrich, a former Speaker of the House who has a PhD, Rudy Giuliani, who is a former mayor of liberal New York, who was prone to cross-dressing in public. You have the person being discussed for Treasury Secretary is Steve Mnuchin, one of his advisors, who is a former who was in Goldman Sachs for 17 years. So these are hardly the kinds of people that you would put in place who they seem very establishment-oriented figures, in fact.
Do you accept that, Sadhan Anthume? It's my last question before I take a break and change the subject, that the people that he appoints could play a very useful role in restraining his impulsiveness. It's his impulsiveness in a way that worries the outside world. Do you think he could appoint people and then accept their advice and be restrained at their behest?
I certainly hope that that's the case. I'll be looking for evidence for it.